In today's show, we're going to break down a fascinating new feeding study that finds that ultra-processed foods are really hard to self-regulate, and that's why they're incredibly fattening. And so in today's show, let's break it down. The title of this paper is Ultra-Processed Foods Cause Weight Gain and Increased Energy Intake Associated with Reduced Chewing Frequency, a randomized open-label crossover study. And what I love about this study is it really sort of conflicts with what the mainstream dietetic perspective is when it comes to nutrition. Many dietitians and mainstream personal trainers and even doctors say it's okay to have the Pop-Tarts and the Wheat Thins and the pretzels and the Cheez-Its because it's part of a healthy diet, right? Just self-regulate or moderate how much of these ultra-processed foods you can consume. But the reality here is Kraft, Nabisco, General Mills, all these major food companies are intentionally manufacturing these ultra-processed foods so that you overconsume them. They are in the business of selling foods that are really hyper palatable and lend themselves to overconsumption. And that's exactly what this study found. And I think it really exemplifies the point that we've been talking about on this podcast and interviewing over 300 experts over the past 10 years, is that we need to focus on real foods, because in this study, what they did is they randomized people to either have one of two different feeding protocols. All the foods were presented in equal calories. Okay, so the macronutrients were identical. The carbohydrates, fats, and proteins were identical. The total calories presented in the three meals and the snacks were identical in terms of their macronutrients. But the only difference here is one contained real foods and the other contained ultra-processed foods, which, as you know, sadly, about 65% of the calories that people consume are coming from ultra-processed junk food. And it turns out, as you will soon learn, these foods raise your blood triglycerides. They raise your liver enzymes because they cause non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which affects about 38% of US adults. This is a major public health crisis that we are facing here. So when individuals consume, or when you consume ultra-processed foods, this study found you eat them faster, you eat around 800 more calories per day, and that leads to about 1.5 pounds of added fat mass in just 1 week time when comparing the same amount of calories presented. They didn't instruct these individuals to diet. They didn't say self-regulate. They presented about 5,000 calories per day in the lab and said, just have as much as you want. Here's the snacks, here's breakfast, here's lunch. Just self-regulate, eat till you're full, and then we'll take the food away. And then there's a snack, between breakfast and lunch, a snack between lunch and dinner, and then there's dinner. And these study subjects they found in this feeding study, and it's important to recognize there was a washout period. As you can see here from Figure A, this is the graphical abstract of the study. There was a washout period, and then they were randomized to the other intervention. Now, for example, if some study subjects ate the ultra-processed food diet first for the first week, then there was the washout period. They were then presented with the real food. And they wanted to compare biomarkers and also body fat percentages, waist circumference, fat mass gain, muscle mass gain, etc. And they found some really interesting results. And I think this is just important to highlight here. Again, humans are omnivores. We evolved eating healthy, whole, real foods. We are not designed to self-regulate the hyperpalatability and the salt, sugar, fat, and the crispiness that makes these foods so enticing and so hard to self-regulate. And sadly, kid food is mostly ultra-processed. I mean, we talked about that Journal of the American Medical Association article in the fall of 2021 that found that about 68% or so of the calories that kids eat now are coming from these junk foods. And this is why we see adult onset diabetes now affecting children. We see obesity, hypertension, all of this. And so study subjects were presented with energetically equivalent foods. Again, in one arm of the study was real food. In the other arm, it was ultra processed. And let's really dive into and focus on blood triglycerides, because that changed really quickly, very pronouncedly. Body weight, and also eating rate, and then we'll talk about liver fat shortly. But first, I just want to thank you all for being here. If you're enjoying the content, please hit that like button. I would love to know what you think of this video in the comment section below. And because fall is upon us, I want to remind you that vitamin D is really, really important. If you live north of Atlanta, Georgia, between the months of October and March, even if you get outside and you're in the sun, the zenith angle of the sun is insufficient to induce cutaneous synthesis of vitamin D. And that's why our friends over at Myoscience offer the essential fatty nutrients, which pairs not only vitamin D, but vitamin D's cofactor, vitamin K2, in the MK7 form. This is a really affordable supplement that I think you can benefit from, especially if you live north of Atlanta, Georgia, which includes a significant portion of folks in the US. And especially if you live in Northern Europe or Canada, you should be supplementing with both vitamin D and, in my opinion, vitamin K as well, because there's a lot of health benefits with both of these fatty nutrients. You can see what other people are saying over at myoscience.com. That's MYOXCIENCE.com, and use the code podcast to save on the updated essential fatty nutrients that features, again, both vitamin D and vitamin K2 in its MK7 form. This product has been updated in terms of the amount of capsules. There's a 120 count as well as a 180 count at a really affordable price over at myoscience.com. So let's get into it and talk about what the investigators found in this randomized crossover open label study. The researchers were part of a team in Japan, really interesting. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the study subjects were not diabetic. They excluded for all these chronic conditions. So these are relatively healthy people. They're free of overt pathology, but they found that during the ultra-processed food period compared with the real food period, there was a significant increase in energy intake, particularly at dinner, but not at breakfast or snack times. That accounted for over 800 extra calories per day. And I will add, even if you're exercising really intensely, it's hard to outrun 800 calories per day, right? I mean, even if you do an Orange Theory class or an F45 class, or I like to hike and run and things like that, and trying to burn 800 extra calories is quite hard. And it turns out that eating a lot of calories before bedtime can be particularly problematic. I mean, I know there are some people that say, well, timing of nutrients don't really matter. It doesn't matter when you have your calories, but various studies do show that if you overconsume energy in the evening time, that can lead to poor sleep quality, which can affect leptin and ghrelin and all these other appetite satiety sensing hormones, but it can also lead to fat gain, as the study found, which I think is quite interesting. They go on to say the increased energy intake observed during the ultra-processed food period was attributable to consumption of greater quantities of carbohydrates and fats, with no significant difference in the observation of protein intake, which I think is quite interesting. The eating rate was also significantly faster during the ultra-processed food period compared with the real food period, both in terms of kilocalories per minute and grams per minute. They have some really fascinating figures that I'm going to share with you shortly. It's figure 2 specifically. The number of chews per calorie was significantly lower during the ultra-processed food period than during the real food period. The number of chews per gram tended to be lower during the ultra-processed food period than during the real food period. And here's the images here that you can see. As I mentioned, the red bar is the ultra-processed food chewing rate and calories per minute, or grams of food per minute in these different graphs, comparing the blue bar, which is the real food period. As you can see here, at dinner, people wolf down significantly more calories, and that attributed to well over 350 calories extra per day just at dinner. And again, so if you're not exercising, if you're not doing a lot of high intensity interval training or things like that, that's going to lead to extra fat gain, which is exactly what they found in this particular study. If we look at figure 1A here, you see the differences in weight gain over just 7 days. I think this is really important to understand, because how many people go on vacation and you're on vacation, you're like, oh, I'll have the nachos at the pool, and I'll have the burrito, or I'll have the fish sticks or French fries. It's so easy to overconsume that. And many people, when they do go on vacation and they go off the rails and start drinking more and eating more, it's not hard to gain a couple pounds of added fat. And that's essentially what this study found. They found the difference in overall weight gain was 2.2 pounds. Again, these are individuals that are presented with the same amount of calories, fats, carbohydrates, and protein during just a 1 week period of time. And it's not like these people exercised less. They didn't instruct them to change any exercise or walking or movement. Both of the arms of the study, and there was the washout period. So there was no way that eating the real food would make the ultra-processed food period look worse, and vice versa. There was sufficient washout period. I believe it was 3 weeks between the two different feeding arms of the study. So 2.2 pounds of weight difference, and a large percentage of that weight was actually fat mass. And so I think it's kind of interesting to look at why might that be, and then also focus on these biomarkers here in table 3. Really fascinating. And so I admit my bias. I like to look first at insulin and glucose. Well, it turns out there wasn't a significant difference in just 1 week period of time of insulin and glucose. And so let's spend some time on this. This is really important to focus on. When you change your diet, and your lifestyle, That means your exercise, your sleep, your stress management, the toxins that you're ingesting or omitting from your diet. Your triglycerides reflect that very acutely. And so this is what we're going to focus on here. Blood triglycerides. Again, this is table 3. This might be hard for you to read. I suggest if you're in Spotify or iTunes, you click the link and watch the YouTube video of this, because the triglycerides increase by 66 milligrams per deciliter after, and this is a between group difference. Okay. So when you compare the ultra-processed food feeding group versus the real food feeding group, there was a 66 milligram per deciliter increase after the ultra-processed food arm of this study. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, let's look at the liver fat, because as we talk about in our blood work masterclass, you have the blood work cheat sheet that I will link in the description below. The 3 liver function tests that we like to focus on, well, there's really only 3 liver function tests, and these are the alanine, the aspartate aminotransferase, the alanine aminotransferase, and the gamma-glutamyl transpeptidase, known as by the acronyms AST, ALT, and GGT. What we see here for the AST, that increased by 15 units, international units per liter. The ALT, which is a little bit more specific than AST, looking at hepatic fat or liver fat, that increased by 28 international units per liter, quite profoundly, I might add, when we're comparing, again, the ultra-processed food group versus the real food group. And then if we look at the GGT, and this one is very specific for liver fat, most doctors, sadly, do omit this from their standard routine physicals, because if you're not an alcoholic or you don't drink significant amount of alcohol, I've learned from my physician friends that this is inked in their mind indelibly through residency. You don't really want to look for GGT. It's not really that important, but as a biomarker of liver fat and metabolic health trend or trajectory, we like to look at GGT. This is a really important marker that actually indirectly looks at glutathione demand and turnover in the body. And it turns out that when when you expose yourself to things like alcohol, persistent organic pollutants, organophosphates, and toxins in your cosmetic products or cleaning products, hair products, or even in your food, as well as ultra-processed foods, GGT will tend to increase. And that's exactly what the investigators found. In just 1 week, GGT increased by 14 international units per liter, which is really profound and not a good thing. As I mentioned, about 38% of adults worldwide are on the trajectory of developing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is a major, major public health crisis and problem that we're going to be hearing about more and more. So just to summarize here, we often hear about, well, look at your glucose, look at your insulin. There were non-significant changes in both insulin and glucose, despite the fact that the individuals eating processed foods gained, as you just heard, about 2.2 pounds of overall body weight. Most of that was from fat. All right, their liver fat increased, but their blood glucose and insulin didn't change. The body has a great way of adapting, and it takes a long time for blood glucose and insulin to start to become a major problem. And that's why we want to look at the liver and the blood triglycerides, because it turns out that the liver is a key metabolic organ. And when your health is going in the wrong direction, your liver will start to reflect those changes. And vice versa. When you start to improve your metabolic health and start exercising, liver fat tends to decrease quite quickly, and your blood triglycerides will decrease quickly as well. And so these are the first, I think, biomarkers that we should be looking at. If we look at LDL cholesterol, it only increased by 11 milligrams per deciliter, which is not that much, right? And so you wouldn't see significant changes, as I mentioned, that quickly in LDL. And it turns out with glucose and insulin and even hemoglobin A1C, not that significant between group differences. But it turns out that the blood triglycerides and liver enzymes don't lie. So that's a key, I think, take home here to consider, and a biomarker for many of you to consider, because it turns out that fasting insulin and post-meal insulin, there's a lot of adaptations that can occur, and that can take years to start to reflect improvement. So be nice on yourself if you are noticing a drop in your blood triglycerides and a drop in your liver enzymes. That would suggest that things are improving after you make those lifestyle changes. Now, let's finish up here with the gut hormones. I think this is really important as it pertains to eating rate and a take-home message, when it comes to optimizing your body composition as well as metabolic health. The investigators say several studies have shown that chewing 40 times before swallowing a fixed amount of food, as opposed to just 15 times, resulted in elevated postprandial release of the gut hormone, GLP-1. Now, you know this to be very important in terms of metabolic health as well as body composition, because the drug Ozempic, or semaglutide, is a pharmacologic synthetic mimic of GLP-1. It's an agonist that will stimulate the release of GLP-1. And so it turns out that just mindfully eating your food is a powerful way to increase this gut hormone. And that in turn will improve your metabolic health as well as body composition. And so that's why they propose here, or postulate, that eating really quickly this ultra-processed food doesn't properly release the amount of GLP-1 from the gut that would send these satiety mechanisms to the brain to help to self-regulate consumption of the ultra-processed food. They go on to say that chewing enhances the bioavailability of nutrients by breaking down the food matrix into smaller particles. The increased bioaccessibility of nutrients stimulates the secretion of appetite-related hormones from the gastrointestinal tract, possibly leading to increased satiety and regulation of food intake through the gut-brain axis. A meta-analysis suggested that thorough chewing of food may decrease food intake through alterations in the gut hormone response related to satiety. And so they do postulate in this study that because ultra-processed food is essentially manufactured, right, from all these different food-like compounds, it doesn't require extensive chewing. Now, you could probably prove this to yourself at home. Let's say you were to make 1,000 calories of a ribeye steak or eat 1,000 calories of Pop-Tarts and time yourself. It would be really easy to eat 1,000 calories of Pop-Tarts in a much quicker time period compared to 1,000 calories from a ribeye steak. You have to cut it, you have to chew it, you have to actually masticate that protein, that animal flesh. In contrast, you can just wolf down Pop-Tarts or chips or French fries or Cheez-Its, fill in the blank. Pringles, all of those foods are really easy to overconsume. I remember when I was a kid, at home, we had a family of, we had 4 boys in our household. We had a big thing of goldfish, and we would open it up and we would all tell ourselves, we're just going to have a handful of goldfish. Before you knew it, all 4 boys and my dad we loved goldfish growing up. The whole thing was gone in like minutes time. Now, that really wouldn't happen if we all had 4 pounds of ground beef, for example, right? There's a lot more natural satiety with these whole real foods, or even rice or potatoes, right? You have to really actually chew these foods and masticate them. And the process of chewing and mastication releases or helps to induce the cephalic phase of digestion, which tells your gut hormones, the so-called incretin effect, to release, which help with post-meal processing. So you can see here how just the act of chewing and taking time for your food can naturally improve your body composition and overall metabolic health. And that's exactly what this study found. So in conclusion, it turns out that eating ultra-processed foods, if you are presented with them, you will eat significantly more calories than you expected to eat. And that can translate into body fat gain and deleterious changes in your metabolic health, which over the course of your lifetime can predispose you to many chronic conditions. So that's the take home here is, in my opinion, even healthier versions, so-called greenwashing, there's all sorts of organic, gluten-free chips, gluten-free, low sugar Pop-Tarts, all of these foods. I really advise that you don't consume them and you start to make your food at home from scratch. As we film this video, I'm making pasta, and that included 14-hour fermented einkorn flour with 12 egg yolks. And so we might eat that pasta, but the glycemic index is significantly different compared to store-bought pasta, and there's way more protein because we're using egg yolks from backyard chickens. So getting in the process of making your food from scratch to the best of your abilities, learn how to do this. There are all sorts of cooking classes, online courses where you can learn how to make your own food from scratch. When you buy ultra-processed packaged food, even if it's labeled organic, even if it's gluten-free, even if it says vegan on the package, you're still likely to overconsume that, and that will derail your health efforts. It's going to negate all the work that you do in the gym, all of the walking and the hiking. When you have those foods, it's going to make everything more challenging. So the best thing to do is just not bring them in the house, because if they're in the house, you're going to eat them. In fact, studies do show when foods are labeled as organic or low calorie or low sugar, you're more likely to even overconsume them because you believe them to be healthier than they actually are. There was a researcher at Michigan State University. In short, if you haven't read this study, the investigator presented study subjects with identical calories and amounts of the same milkshake, but they just had different labels. And the milkshake that was labeled as healthy, light, and so forth, people overconsumed that because they perceived it to be healthier. So I think it's important just to acknowledge that The gluten-free processed foods are actually a little bit more dangerous, even though on a calorie basis, they probably have better ingredients, but because you perceive them to be healthier, you're more likely to overconsume them. So just be aware of that. What do you think of this study, and what do you think of that notion? I would love to know in the comment section below. As always, I appreciate you tuning all the way to the very end. We'll catch you on a future video down the road.